Does anyone actually do this correctly? I can never truly tell. I've seen so many of these videos in the last couple of years. This one, this one, this one. There's so many books like Defining Decade or 101 Secrets to Your 20s and so many more. Yet, I don't think I've met anyone without any sense of regret at all. It seems like there's just too many advice on everything sometimes. But a question I keep finding myself asking is, if I could transport myself back to the 12-year-old Darsh, what things would I change about my life? Yeah, I'd probably buy a lot of Bitcoin, save Harambe, and then maybe stop myself from simping one too many times. And probably a bunch of other things. But that's like the obvious things. I do think though, ultimately, the nature of my experience, even with all that future knowledge, wouldn't really change. At least not in the emotional sense. Like even back then, there were already things I planned for in the future. There were things I knew were going to be helpful. So my motivations, my feeling states, all those stuff would probably change as well. I could still imagine doing all the right things and then turning 24 just to regret things once again. Things can always be better. Things can always be worse. Regret is just that. I tend to think that regret is just an ever-present human emotion when we're not aware of the moment. We're always going to want things to be better. So for this reason, I'm fully convinced that you could find a moment of satisfaction at any moment. In that moment of awareness, regret, confusion, meaninglessness, feeling lost, it truly vanishes. Whether you're religious or not, I think that sense of wholeness is truly available at moment-to-moment basis. That being said though, that statement alone is probably not a good strategy for living a good life. I could literally imagine myself scrolling on TikTok for 16 hours a day and binging shows for hours and hours, getting into fights on Facebook for no reason, doing all those things and technically feeling okay with it just because I felt whole. Honestly, there probably isn't anything really wrong with that either. But I don't think I've met anyone with an internal state of peace in their mind that lives their life like that, but it's not impossible either. So maybe there could be a general strategy in your 20s that's really helpful. Some things could probably make your 20s an ideal. Let's focus on that. Avoiding addiction traps. This is such a tricky topic to navigate. Obviously, I'm not an expert, but also because I think addiction could be applied so broadly. I think one of the ways I define addiction, similar to the way that Dr. Human also describes it, which is addiction is that progressive narrowing of things that bring you pleasure. Basically, the more addicted you are to specific things, the less pleasure you find in other things. So menial tasks are dreadful when you're addicted to things. With that definition, addiction can range from so many different things. Anything from food, pornography, video games, to even arguably things like working, exercise, family, seeking of knowledge, all of it. Clearly, some addictions are probably worse than others in terms of the fact that it narrows your life more and is more fundamental. I'd rather be addicted to knowledge and working too much than to drugs. I'd rather be addicted to working out than video games. Spending time on those things at the expense of other things might not be the best use of your 20s. But of course, all this also depends on the context. For example, if you're a streamer or a professional gamer or someone that's fully retired, these things might make sense to some extent. So there's definitely a rank order here, but I'm gonna leave that up to you to decide. On the more fundamental level, I think the addiction that I personally struggle with the most is scrolling social media, watching too much stuff for my own good, podcasts and long videos, reading too many books. I also sometimes have a habit of binge eating food. Like the other day, my parents bought these tamarind boxes from Costco and I finished the whole serving in 3 days. It was 8 servings a day, probably an extra 700 calories just from tamarind. So I think some of this kind of stuff is probably unavoidable for most people. You're always going to have some habit that's not ideal. But here's how I've avoided some of the more poisonous traps in my own life. 1. Naming the feeling of wanting something and giving attention to it. For example, when I wake up in the morning, I really have the urge to scroll to TikTok and check my messages right away. It's my first instinct. So when I wake up, I name that feeling. Oh, I want to check this. Even if it's for a brief 30 seconds, give that feeling and attention. Eventually, the power it has over me starts declining. Second example, I really crave something sweet and savory around 11 a.m. By this time, I've already finished my workout. I have 1 more hour of fasting where I work on stuff. So it's really hard to combat that. So in this time, I also name my hunger. I name my craving. I watch over it. The challenge of doing that has been really helpful in my workflow. Another strategy I use to beat addiction traps is I create space to do nothing. And I mean nothing at all. Literally just sit there and be bored. For example, I'll go to the bathroom sometimes. Instead of checking my phone or even bringing it, I do nothing. I actually just poop. Isn't that kind of crazy? I feel like I used to do that way more often. Sometimes I'll even go on 30-minute walks to grocery stores or whatever without listening to any music or podcast. Just nothing. Similarly, when I'm doing dishes or folding laundry, the most boring tasks of all time, the urge to like listen to something is always there. At least for some of the time, I don't do it. Basically, having those times of not consuming anything, what it did for me was get rid of the feeling of FOMO. It made me okay with missing out on things. Third strategy that I use for beating addiction is being extra cautious about feelings of shame and guilt. This one sounds weird, but hear me out here. One of the craziest things about the addiction cycle is how feelings of guilt and shame continually perpetuates the cycle over and over again. Here's a diagram for that. You have intense craving for something, you forget to notice it. You give into the craving, you feel bad / guilty, and now the negative consequences start. To get rid of the bad, guilty feeling that you have, start the cycle again because that act gives you pleasure. You start partaking in the activity again. Sometimes, like when you break a habit by a little bit, you kind of give into the, oh, what the hell effect, where you just start binging everything all at once. That is partly because of our refusal to notice the feeling of shame. There's an element of pride that comes out of doing that act. And so the cycle continues over and over again. All this can be avoided by just naming the feeling, truly feeling it. It doesn't lead to guilt and shame and that behavior as much. And let's say you do accidentally miss it, accidentally give in. You're free to restart at any moment. I promise if you keep doing this, you'll eventually break the habit. At least you'll do it less often. And in my opinion, you'll probably fall into the addiction cycle a lot less. Goal is to completely break this cycle altogether for all habits, in my opinion. So that way, like, you don't ever need anything external to feel that sense of wholeness. The next big thing I want to talk about in your 20s that you might want to avoid, relationship trap. This one is a super interesting one in my opinion. I think your family structure, your friends that you grew up around, the type of culture that you grew up in, your attachment styles, all the things you had in your younger years definitely largely affect stuff like this. So a lot of this probably requires some kind of professional help for many people as well. But I do want to shed some insight into how you can start improving things right now. One of my favorite quotes about a relationship is, you will never meet the same person twice. In fact, with the universe in flux, with you in flux, you might never meet the same person once. Keeping this idea in mind, two mistakes that people make, especially in our age group, are these. Number one, using people only as means of end. There's of course nothing wrong with wanting or asking people for things, but in my opinion, if it's only to ever get something out of it, it does not create a good long-term relationship. Plus, it will probably start affecting the way that you view your own close friendships as well. Just as much as you're influencing other people, they're also influencing you. I think this is especially true for guys my age when they get into romantic situations, whether it's just for sex or just for having a pretty girlfriend. I just don't think we should get into the habit of using people intentionally and overtly. Ultimately, maybe everything is a subvert contract, but doing it overtly, I think it's a bad idea. If we continue to use other people only as a way to meet our own ends, then the fear that other people are only doing that to us will only exponentially increase over time. I think this leads us to feeling very disconnected, paranoid, and lonely. I actually think there's a very practical and fundamental way of practicing this skill that I'll talk about more towards the end of this section. But let me get to the second point. The fear of rejection and the fear of rejecting. These two are the same part of the coin in my opinion. Not being able to say no to things is obviously a problem. Sometimes friends are wonderful. They invite us to a lot of things and they create a lot of stuff for you. I could easily imagine spending the rest of my life just messing around and having fun with friends. But of course, there has to be a limit for the sake of both parties. In the best case scenario, you're only having non-harmful interactions, or you might be wasting time from your goal. In the worst case scenario, not being able to say no to these kind of relationships might set you up on like the criminal path, whether it's like constant partying or drugs or being disrespectful to people. By definition, not being able to say no to things will eventually lead to those circumstances. The company you choose does matter. It could easily be managed by understanding these two things. Like personally, I tend towards being more reluctant to say no to things, mainly because I enjoy the company that I keep. But I also think it's partly inherited from my parents. My parents almost never say no to things because they're so afraid of looking bad and getting bad-mouthed by their relatives. But either way, the fear of being socially rejected will set you back from ever being able to make boundaries. Is there a solution to this? How do I really manage my relationship? In my opinion, both of those traps that I talked about, fear of being rejected, the fear of rejecting, and using people only as a means to an end, both have the idea of forcing something to be there when it's not. And I don't just mean for your well-being and happiness. I mean it for things like business partnerships, employment, romantic relationships, anything really. All those endeavors, it has to be a level of mutual respect. Ultimately, our inability to realize that being completely alone can be a moment of great satisfaction causes this. If we really figured out how to do this moment to moment, I think we would filter out unhelpful people pretty fast. It would make us cling to things a lot less. And so, fear of being rejected kind of goes away in that case. So I want to talk about the practice of metta. Doing all those things are important, but I also think it's important to learn how to truly care for someone for the sake of caring. Actually getting rid of the means to an end thing completely. Just because someone is a good companion or friend, that does not make other people that are not like that bad. It doesn't mean that they don't have a place to play in the world. I actually firmly believe in the fact that ultimately you really do never have enemies. Not at all. Everything and everyone has a part to play. So how do we go about practicing this idea of loving someone without any expectation or clinginess? This is where the practice of metta comes into play. It reminds me that there's often experiences that are bigger than my own, while also helping me set a boundary. So here's how you do it. After you find a place to sit down and calm down for a little bit, notice where your attention goes. Once you settle down in that, start with a wellness prayer for yourself. Say something like, may I be happy, may I have love, may I have health, may I have the strength to overcome all hardships, may I have ease of well-being. Let the feeling of well-being just wash over you. Say these words over and over and over and over again. Then think of someone that you really cherish in your life, that you really naturally love, and say, may she have love, may she have happiness, may she have ease of well-being, may she have the strength to overcome all hardship, and let the feeling of like well-being and love just wash over her or whoever you're thinking about. Take some time here. Now, try to think of someone neutral and then say the same exact prayer again. May this person have happiness, may this person have health, so on and so forth. Finally, towards the end, you think of someone that's more of an adversary, someone that you think you're in conflict with. And then you let the same exact wellness prayer flow to him or her. And that feeling of wellness and love kind of washed over everything. This practice, alongside the practice of staying alone in moments, will truly help you set boundaries and learn to love others. Best moment to start is now. Just try it out. Maybe it'll help you. Let me switch to talk about the third thing that might be important to think about in your 20s, status, which might sound kind of funny coming from me, given the fact that I just told you all the spiritual stuff. So the reason why I think status is really important here, I don't just mean hierarchically like alpha and beta or whatever. That's a whole different landscape that I would love to like make a video on, I guess. For now, that's not the point. What I mean is actually the game of learning to have as much freedom as possible by the end of your life. We could definitely start setting ourselves up for that. What I'm talking about here is the ability to have leverage and options in things like the workplace. Trying to set yourself to be in a position where you do things because you truly want to and not just because you have to. You have to be very careful around this topic because of how much scam-oriented stuff actually exists in the online space. All of us want to work less on things that we don't want to. So naturally, it's a lot of scam artists because it's just a fundamental human desire. But the book and podcast by Cal Newport helped me understand that this is actually truly possible. The book's name is So Good They Can't Ignore You. And the podcast is, I think, Deep Work with Cal Newport. The basic idea here is that some careers like doctors have leverage because it's a skill that's the most needed in society. This means they have status and slightly more freedom to reject authority and say no to things when they feel like it's not right. Software engineers also have the same leverage. Very few people have the skill set, but there's a very high demand for it. So as you know, they often enjoy a much better work-life balance. But for example, I don't think YouTubers have the highest amount of leverage. It's not in the entry-level space. That's because almost everyone wants to be one, so it's pretty difficult. However, once you break past the entry level, there's actually a ton of leverage created just because of its scalability. There's always someone to watch your stuff. So that's another way to increase leverage. So that's the thing. Increasing leverage is possible in many different ways. You can learn a high demand skill, basically become needed in some sense. It's also not simply just about chasing your passion, instead chasing skill sets that you might not even like that eventually allow you to do your passion. Because it allows you to have more free time over time as you have more leverage. That's the probably most strategically sound way of achieving financial freedom that I've seen. That being said though, status is a long game. Understanding that basically helped me manage my expectation much better. Funnily enough though, the ultimate status game is to completely get rid of the status game altogether. Completely be able to check out the rat race, in my opinion, and renounce everything. This is the thing as well, like I've seen some YouTubers do this. Like they go and live in a hut. PewDiePie, for example, kind of did this by going to Japan. In these cases, we aren't just free from our employers or family expectations, but also free from our own mind, becoming more free from things like greed, delusion, and hatred. I once heard Naval Ravikant talk about this. Yeah, this is kind of possible in a more practical sense. And this idea of being free from your own wants ultimately is possible to remember at any stage of the game. Like, go through your entire journey. Right now, I know that I'll probably get rejected from like hundreds of jobs. I'll probably be overworked a lot. I'll be short on money and time. I want to be able to get to a point financially where I don't have to do that. And I want to learn more skills to achieve freedom, really. Even though that's a long-term goal, at this moment right now, I could learn to be free from that greed. I think it's possible to make the mind completely at peace, even while chasing after those esoteric goals. I could truly be here as if it's my first time experiencing this moment, even if it's not the most ideal time I could imagine. But that sense of craving and need will always keep consuming you, and that regret naturally will follow that. Chase for our status and power, whatever it might be. I think it's possible, desirable, and practical for us to have a clear, stable, and happy mind through the whole process. So the real answer for our regret in our 20s is probably to learn how to do that moment to moment, and ultimately kind of letting time and the universe or whatever take its course. When you really think about it though, beyond the basics like exercising, eating healthy, having good relationships, and maybe like investing, there really isn't that much stuff that you could do right. Even in the cases where we did everything correctly, as human beings, we're always designed to feel regret. We always want to do more. Even if you do everything wrong, in that moment of recognition, I think it's really possible to be whole. You could be 14, 25, or 70, have wasted all of your life, but if you recognize that one moment, I think you could start over right there. The nature of unsatisfactoriness can be ended at any moment. So I hope you find that video helpful. If not, just leave in the comments of how I could improve my video, other things you want me to talk about. Other than that, like, comment, and subscribe.